She doesn't just wear ink. She wears a story she couldn't say out loud. Carl Jung saw it coming. When women silence their pain, it starts speaking in symbols. Be very careful before you fall in love with her tattoos, because they aren't what you think they are. They're not just edgy decorations. They're not merely statements of rebellion or style or self-expression. They're not harmless lines of ink on skin. They're symbols, markers, emotional signatures left behind by experiences too big, too raw, or too shameful to speak out loud. You might think they're just art, but they're archetypal warnings written in a language you were never taught to read. Because every tattoo she's chosen carries a story, and not the one she tells her friends, not the filtered version for Instagram or the clever caption she rehearsed in the mirror. No, her real story lives underneath the image. It's in the emotional imprint of the moment she sat in that chair and decided to endure pain, permanence, and exposure just to put something on her body she couldn't quite express in her soul. You think it's a butterfly. She thinks it's transformation. But Jung would say, look deeper. That's not transformation, that's compensation. That's the visible proof of an invisible fracture she hasn't fully integrated. Tattoos, especially in women, are rarely neutral. They are attempts to map meaning onto pain, identity onto fragmentation, power onto wounds. And most people will never admit this out loud, because we live in a culture that praises the image while ignoring the unconscious motive behind it. We applaud confidence, rebellion, and creativity without ever asking where that impulse comes from. But Jungian psychology doesn't let us stop there. It drags us beneath the surface. It asks the hard question: what unmet need, what unintegrated shadow, what buried trauma is this tattoo trying to make visible? See, Carl Jung understood something terrifying and beautiful. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That includes the images we put on our skin. We don't choose them randomly, not really. The unconscious chooses, and we obey, thinking we're free. That's why the harsh truth about female tattoos isn't about fashion or trends. It's about identity. Borrowed identity, compensated identity, persona. That rose on her shoulder. It's not just a flower, it's a scream for softness in a world that's punished her every time she showed it. That dagger on her thigh, it's not power, it's protection. It's the animus rising in her to shield the feminine she no longer trusts the world to honor. That snake coiled around her spine, it's not mysticism, it's memory. It's the Kundalini force trying to rise through pain she hasn't yet released. And if you're really paying attention, you'll start to notice a pattern. A silent echo behind every tattooed woman you meet. You'll sense it in the way she wears her ink-like armor, in how her voice slightly shifts when she talks about it, like she's trying to convince you, or maybe herself, that it was just a choice, a fun decision, an expression of freedom. But freedom doesn't usually come with a need to be seen. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The more someone needs you to see their tattoos, the less integrated that symbol usually is. Because true symbols, real ones, don't demand validation. They don't need applause. They live quietly, almost secretly inside the psyche. When they make their way to the skin, they do so without fanfare. They are whispered truths, not shouted ones. So when a woman is covered in loud symbols, bold designs, intense colors, repeated statements, don't just see ink, see the unconscious trying to speak. Most people won't. Most people will romanticize her, sexualize her, idolize her for being free or different or fearless. But you have a choice. You can keep admiring the image, or you can start listening to the truth underneath. That truth might scare you because it breaks the illusion. It reveals that what you thought was power might actually be pain, that what looked like rebellion might actually be unresolved trauma. and that the woman you were drawn to might be someone still trying to find the version of herself she lost a long time ago. But that's where the real beauty begins. Because Jung never taught us to judge the unconscious, he taught us to listen to it, to integrate it, to make peace with the parts of ourselves we've buried. And for many women today, tattoos are not just fashion, they are psychic flares, signals from the depths of the unconscious crying out for integration. If you ignore that, if you only ever see the tattoo and not the story, you'll miss her entirely. You'll mistake performance for presence, image for essence. You'll think you know her when all you've met is the mask. So the next time you see a woman with ink, don't rush to judgment. But don't rush to fantasy either. Instead, ask yourself, what part of her shadow is she trying to make visible? What part of her soul was so silenced that she had to put it in ink just to keep it from disappearing? And most importantly, what is she trying to remember? Because more often than not, her tattoos aren't about expression. They're about survival. They're about reclaiming parts of herself she didn't know how to grieve. They're archetypal messages coded in symbols, hoping someone might finally decode them without flinching. You can dismiss it, you can laugh it off as over-analysis, or you can wake up. You can wake up to what her ink is really trying to say. And if you do, you won't just see her tattoos. You'll see her. It didn't happen overnight, but if you look closely, you'll notice the shift. A few decades ago, a tattoo on a woman was considered taboo, rebellious, or deviant. It was something other women did, those outside the bounds of what was considered respectable or feminine. But now, tattoos are not only accepted, they're celebrated. Ubiquitous, almost expected in certain circles. But why? Why have so many women across cultures, age groups, and social strata turned to body ink as a form of self-expression? The answer is deeper than trends, deeper than fashion. It lies at the core of Jungian psychology, where the self splits into layers, where our visible identity is only the tip of the iceberg, and where much of what we present to the world is not who we are, but who we think we need to be. Carl Jung called this outer layer the persona, the mask we wear to navigate society. It's not inherently fake or malicious, it's functional, but it is, by nature, incomplete. And here's where the tattoo comes in. For many modern women, tattoos have become an extension of the persona, a carefully curated mask etched onto the body. Not just clothing you can change or makeup you can wash off, but a permanent statement, something that says, "This is who I am," even when the truth is more complicated. Even when the truth is the exact opposite. And that's the paradox. Tattoos are supposed to be personal, real, raw, yet in practice they often serve the same purpose as the persona, to conceal, to compensate, or to control perception. Because what happens when a woman isn't allowed to express anger, but feels it burning inside her every day? What happens when softness is punished, vulnerability exploited, or longing dismissed? She adapts. She finds new ways to speak, and often she turns to symbols. Symbols don't need approval. They don't ask permission. They bypass logic and go straight into the psyche. That's their power. And that's why so many women tattoo them onto their bodies, not because they fully understand them, but because they feel them. Deeply, urgently, unconsciously. It's not a calculated decision for most. It's an emotional one. An intuitive one. A silent language spoken through ink when spoken language failed. This is where Jung's view of the unconscious becomes critical, because what we repress doesn't disappear. It finds other ways to live. The woman who was never allowed to cry might ink a quote about strength across her ribcage. The woman whose boundaries were shattered might tattoo barbed wire around her arm. The one who longed to be wild but was taught to be obedient might choose the wings of a phoenix or a wild animal. Not just because it's beautiful, but because something inside her is begging to be seen. These tattoos become mirrors not of her fully integrated self, but of her unmet needs and unclaimed emotions. They reflect the gap between who she had to become and who she truly is. And the tragedy? Most people will never see it. They'll compliment the design, they'll ask what it means, they'll hear the rehearsed answer she gives, but they won't see her. They won't see that the ink is a mask just as much as it's a message, that the symbol is real, but the story she tells about it might not be. Let's look closer. There's a woman who tattoos the word resilience in bold script on her forearm. To the outside world, she's a fighter, a survivor, unbreakable. But if you sit with her long enough, you notice something else. Her eyes betray exhaustion. Her laugh feels distant. She's constantly proving herself, constantly explaining, constantly holding up the image of strength. Because underneath the tattoo, underneath the persona, she's terrified. Terrified of being seen as weak, of falling apart, of admitting that her strength came from necessity, not choice. She doesn't wear resilience like a crown, she wears it like armor. Then there's another woman, full of vibrant tattoos, colorful, chaotic, mythological creatures snaking across her body like living art. She seems wild, untamed, sexually liberated, the kind of person who doesn't follow rules, who radiates freedom. But talk to her about intimacy and she shuts down. She changes the subject. Her eyes dart, her shoulders tighten. The wildness is a projection, a persona she created because true connection felt too dangerous. Her tattoos scream, "I'm alive," but her heart whispers, "Don't get too close." These aren't isolated examples, these are patterns, archetypal patterns, repeated symbols with repeated stories. And Jung would tell us to take them seriously, not just as artwork, but as psychic content, as manifestations of the unconscious trying to make itself known. Tattoos in this light become more than self-pression. They become a kind of soul mapping, a visual autobiography written in metaphors. But the danger is this: if the tattoo becomes a substitute for inner work, if it becomes the only way a woman lets herself feel powerful or expressive or sacred, it can imprison her just as easily as it frees her. Because once something becomes part of the persona, it's very difficult to question it, to remove it, to admit that maybe the story behind it isn't the full truth. That's the thing about masks. They're hard to take off, especially when they're permanently inked into your identity. But that doesn't mean all tattoos are masks. Some are mirrors of integration. Some are sacred rituals, chosen not from pain, but from wholeness. The key difference lies in consciousness. Are you choosing the symbol, or is the symbol choosing you? Jung would ask, what part of yourself are you trying to express or hide? What wound is the tattoo speaking for? What persona is it building? And here's the hard part. Most of the time, you won't know. Not right away, because the unconscious doesn't send text messages, it speaks in symbols, and unless you're willing to decode them, willing to ask what lies beneath the ink, you'll miss the message entirely. You live the story on your skin, without ever living the truth it was trying to tell. So when you see a woman with tattoos, pause. Don't judge her, but don't romanticize her either. Ask yourself, what pain needed a picture? What truth needed camouflage? What mask needed to become permanent? And then, if you're brave enough, ask the same questions about yourself. The shadow doesn't knock before it enters. It creeps in quietly, lives beneath your daily smile, behind your choices, your habits, your relationships. Carl Jung described it as the thing a person has no wish to be. Not because it isn't real, but because it's terrifying. Because it holds all the parts of you that were shamed, silenced, rejected, or feared. And yet, the shadow is always trying to be seen. Sometimes it speaks through projection, sometimes through sabotage, and sometimes, especially today, it speaks through ink. Because what you repress doesn't vanish, it gets creative. For many women, the tattoo has become that creative outlet, but not in the way most people think. They say it's art, it's beauty, it's freedom, but often the ink isn't a celebration of liberation. It's a scar, a timey stamp, a coded confession etched permanently on skin because the heart wasn't ready to say it out loud. You didn't choose that image just because it looked good. The shadow chose it. You just held still while the needle wrote the story. You can see it when you look at her, really look, the woman who has flames down her arm, but a quiet fear of letting anyone close enough to feel her warmth. The one who tattoos quotes about strength, but collapses at the slightest sign of emotional confrontation. The one who inks daggers and wolves and wildness, but still can't speak her truth to her father. This is not criticism, this is shadow work. This is the uncomfortable recognition that the parts of ourselves we bury don't die, they decorate. When Jung talked about the shadow, he didn't mean evil, he meant disowned, repressed, rejected by your conscious self because someone somewhere taught you that part of you was unacceptable. For many women, that shadow includes rage, deep, holy, unexpressed rage. It includes grief, generational, ancestral, invisible, and it includes the ache of being told that your softness, your desire, your chaos, your voice were too much. So you adapt, you edit yourself, you trade your authentic fire for approval, and you become half of who you are. But the other half doesn't vanish. It waits. And when it can't wait anymore, it surfaces in the most poetic way it can, through symbols. A tattoo becomes more than just an image. It becomes a container, a vessel for what couldn't be processed, named, or healed. You put it on your body to say, "This happened to me," even if you can't say what this is. And here's the brutal truth. For many women, trauma chooses the tattoo, not the other way around. She doesn't wake up and think, "I want to wear my healing today." She wakes up in the aftermath of betrayal, heartbreak, abuse, abandonment, and without words, she finds a symbol. She says, "This tiger represents my strength." But really, the tiger represents the predator she never saw coming, the one that taught her never to trust again. She says, "This quote reminds me to keep going." But it's not motivation, it's survival. It's the echo of nights she wanted to give up, but didn't. She says, "These wings mean freedom," but it's not freedom she feels, it's the cage. And the wings are her way of pretending she's already flown away. This isn't weakness, this is unconscious intelligence. This is the shadow's way of saying, "If you won't let me speak, I'll show myself another way." And it does. Through colors, shapes, animals, weapons, gods, wounds. Through any symbol that might let the pain breathe without unraveling the whole self. But there's a danger in this kind of expression, because when you turn your shadow into art without integrating it, you don't heal it, you just glamorize it, you build an identity around it, and eventually you confuse the symbol for the self. She's not just the girl with the sword tattoo, she becomes the warrior, but only on the outside. Inside, she still flinches at conflict, she still folds under pressure, but the image keeps her safe, keeps her distant, keeps others from asking real questions, because the shadow has become armor. Not the kind you wear on your body, the kind you wear in your energy, in your posture, in your voice. The tattoo is just the tip of it. The real armor is psychological, emotional, a defense mechanism dressed up as authenticity. It looks like empowerment, but it's not. It's performance. It's a curated version of strength that protects her from ever having to be vulnerable again. Because if she lets the armor drop, even for a second, the grief will pour out, the anger, the fear, the parts of her that were never allowed to exist in the first place. So she keeps it together, she adds more ink. Each tattoo becomes another brick in the fortress, another story to distract from the silence underneath. But Here's the thing about psychological armor. It works until it doesn't. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you isolated. It makes you feel powerful, but it also makes you hard to reach. And sooner or later, it stops protecting you and starts imprisoning you. You look in the mirror and you see your symbols, your statements, your rebellion, but you don't see yourself. Because the shadow wound was never healed, it was only decorated. Jung warned us about this. He said that the shadow is 90% pure gold. That means the parts of you you've rejected are not just pain, they're power, they're truth. They're the pieces of your soul you were meant to reclaim. But you can't do that if you're using tattoos to bypass the work, to avoid the grief, to freeze your identity in a symbol instead of letting it evolve. Symbols are powerful, they're sacred, but only when they're conscious. When they're unconscious, they become traps. You start to believe the image is enough, that the phoenix on your back means you've risen, that the lion on your chest means you're brave, that the broken heart stitched with thorns means you've healed. But you haven't, not yet. Not until you go inward, not until you face the rage, the grief, the chaos, the feminine shadow that modern culture still doesn't know how to honor. Because that's what's really underneath the ink, not just a tattoo, but a soul trying to tell the truth in a language it hopes someone someday might finally understand. So the next time you look at your tattoos, ask yourself, did I choose this, or did my pain choose it for me? And more importantly, am I willing to go back to the place that made this symbol necessary in the first place? Because only then does the shadow stop screaming. Only then does the symbol become sacred. Only then do you begin to remember who you were before you needed the ink to speak for you. There's a certain kind of tattoo that doesn't whisper, it warns. You've seen it. The fierce script etched across her collarbone, the dark, jagged blade winding down her ribcage. The scorpion, the snake, the warrior goddess with eyes that burn. It says, without saying, don't come too close. Don't test me. I've been hurt, and I won't let it happen again. And most people see that and think confidence, power, strength. But Jung would see something else. He would see the animus, the unconscious masculine within the female psyche, rising to the surface not as a balanced inner ally, but as a defensive force, a protector, a mask, a stand-in for what's been wounded, hidden, or exiled. The animus isn't a flaw, it's not something to be eliminated. Jung saw it as essential, just as the anima, the unconscious feminine in men, is essential. It's the bridge to wholeness, the inner opposite, the pathway to integration. But when the animus is unbalanced, it doesn't lead a woman deeper into herself. It leads her away from her softness, away from her receptivity, away from the very qualities that once defined the sacred feminine. What happens instead is this. A woman experiences betrayal, neglect, or violation. She learns that being open is dangerous, that being soft means being weak, that surrender equals pain. So she armors up, not just emotionally but energetically, and the animus steps in to take control. He doesn't whisper, he commands. He says, you will not be hurt again. You will control the narrative. You will become untouchable. And one of the ways he expresses that untouchability? Through tattoos. Not all tattoos, but the ones that assert dominance, radiate threat, or sexualize power. They often come from this place. A place where the animus is no longer a guide but a gatekeeper. Not the doorway to wholeness, but the prison guard of pain. You'll see it in the women who cover their bodies in symbols of war, chaos, fire, blood, not because they feel wild, but because they feel trapped. And being seen as dangerous is safer than being seen as vulnerable. This is how the inner masculine becomes distorted, and it has emotional consequences, ones that ripple far beyond ink. Because when a woman over-identifies with her animus, she doesn't just protect herself from danger, she often pushes away connection. Real connection. The kind that requires softness, presence, surrender. Instead, she attracts what she unconsciously believes she deserves: emotionally unavailable men. Men who mirror her own walls, her own avoidance, her own inability to be truly held. She wants intimacy but can't receive it. She craves protection but doesn't trust anyone to offer it. She longs to be known but hides behind symbols of strength so thick no one dares to ask who she really is. This isn't conscious, it's a pattern, a loop formed in childhood when a father figure was distant, domineering, or absent altogether, when the only masculine energy she knew was either emotionally void or dangerously volatile. So she internalized it. She built her animus out of fragments, defense mechanisms dressed up as empowerment. And then, without realizing it, she began to wear him. She chose tattoos that embodied him, images of warriors, daggers, skulls, demons, predatory animals, not as reflection but as compensation, as if to say, if I can't find safe masculine energy outside me, I'll become it. But you can't become something you don't fully understand. You can only imitate it. And imitation, no matter how convincing, always feels hollow. That's why so many of these tattoos, while visually powerful, carry an undertone of sadness. They're not symbols of peace. They're symbols of battle. Not peace already achieved, but peace still being fought for. Or worse, peace abandoned entirely in favor of control. Because control feels safer than healing. But healing is what she actually wants. She wants to let someone in, to be touched not just physically but emotionally, to be held without performing, to be loved without defending. But when the animus dominates her identity, she doesn't allow that. She only allows the illusion of intimacy, short-lived, surface-level, sexualized encounters that reinforce the very loneliness she's trying to escape. And here's the part no one talks about. These tattoos, seductive as they are, often function not as invitations but as tests. Can you see past this? Can you handle me? And you meet the fire without trying to put it out. But most people can't. Most men, especially, aren't trained to decode what's real beneath the image. They see the ink and assume they know the woman. They either chase her for the thrill or avoid her entirely, but neither truly meets her. Because they're reacting to the animus, not to her. And she knows this. On some level, she feels it. She feels the ache of being admired but not understood, desired but not seen, respected but not loved. And it deepens the divide inside her, the split between who she is and who she's pretending to be. The tattoos, seductive as they may be, become walls. Attractive, captivating walls, but walls nonetheless. They keep people out. At worse, they keep her in. Because the more she invests in the persona of power, the harder it becomes to lay it down, to soften, to say, I'm not okay, to admit, I want more than this, to confess, I'm tired of being strong all the time. This is the tragedy of the overactive animus. It builds a fortress around a heart that's begging to be touched. And the tattoos, they become flags on that fortress. Not declarations of freedom, but of distance, of pain, of the deep, unspoken belief that true love is a risk too great to take. So what does healing look like? It's not the removal of the tattoos, it's not shame, it's not erasure, it's integration. It's the moment when the animus is no longer a mask, but a partner, no longer a defense, but a guide, when she can hold both her fire and her softness without collapsing into either, when she can say, yes, I have scars, yes, I have armor, but I'm not hiding behind them anymore. That's when the tattoos become sacred, not as shields but as stories, not as warnings but as wisdom. But to get there, she has to risk being seen, not just for her symbols but for her soul. And that takes more courage than any ink could ever express. That is the path of wholeness, the path Jung pointed us toward, not the path of performance, but of presence. And that's the truth no one dares to discuss. She's empowered because she's inked. That's the story we're told. That's the image we consume. A woman with tattoos is framed as bold, liberated, fearless, someone who owns her body, her choices, her narrative, and to question that image, to even suggest that it might not always be true, feels almost sacrilegious in today's culture. But Carl Jung wasn't interested in cultural comfort. He was interested in truth. And the truth is, not all rebellion is empowerment. Not all symbols are sacred. Not all tattoos come from freedom. Sometimes they come from fracture. There is a myth, growing stronger with every filtered post and every viral quote, that tattoos equal transformation, that by marking the body you somehow reclaim the soul. But Jung would challenge that idea. He taught that true individuation, the process of becoming your most authentic self, does not seek applause. It's quiet, painful, lonely even. It moves beneath the surface of identity and dives straight into the unconscious, and when you're in the midst of it, the last thing you're thinking about is how it looks from the outside. But our world doesn't reward that kind of depth. It rewards image, imitation, projection. So what happens? Rebellion becomes aesthetic. Identity becomes curated. Pain becomes a brand. And instead of integrating the self, many women start building a persona, one tattoo at a time, not from wholeness, but from the fragments left behind after years of trauma, betrayal, or rejection. The tattoo becomes the signal. Look how far I've come. Look how strong I am. Look how wild or free or unbothered I've become. But if that message isn't rooted in real integration, if it's based on unprocessed wounds, then it's not empowerment, it's performance. There's a difference between the woman who tattoos a phoenix after rising from her ashes and the woman who tattoos a phoenix to convince herself she has. And that difference is internal, invisible, but it's everything. Jung warned us about the dangers of imitation, especially in the age of archetypes. When we borrow symbols without understanding them, we start living someone else's myth. We take on the appearance of transformation without ever facing the shadow that makes real transformation possible. That's what's happening now. The archetype of the empowered, tattooed woman has become a cultural template, one we praise, one we mimic. But imitation isn't individuation, it's a mask. And when enough people wear the same mask, we start to mistake it for the truth. Social media has made this even more seductive. A woman posts a picture of her new ink, deep, symbolic, raw. The comments flood in. You're so strong. You're such an inspiration. This is everything. And for a moment she feels seen, validated, maybe even healed. But that's not healing, that's a feedback loop. An endless cycle where the wound remains untouched, but the symbol of healing is worshipped. And when that worship stops, when the likes fade or the attention shifts, she's left with the same emptiness, the same ache. Only now it's harder to talk about, because she's already declared her power. She's already claimed her healing. To admit that she's still hurting feels like betrayal of herself, of her image, of the story she spent so long trying to believe. So she doubles down, gets another tattoo, posts another quote, builds another layer of the persona. And all the while, the true self, the one who longs to be held, not praised, drifts further into the background. This isn't to shame tattoos, it's to question the myth surrounding them. Wellness, because tattoos can be sacred. When they're chosen from integration, not fragmentation, they become living prayers, silent affirmations, symbols of inner truth that don't need to be explained. They don't shout for attention. They don't beg for understanding. They simply are. Like the woman who tattoos a single symbol on her wrist after years of therapy, journaling, and inner work. She doesn't flaunt it. She barely mentions it. Because the symbol isn't for you, it's for her. A reminder of something only she knows. A truth hard-earned and deeply lived. That's empowerment. Not the image of rebellion, but the embodiment of self. But that's rare, because it requires time, silence, courage, and in a world built on speed, noise, and applause, silence is terrifying. Being unseen feels like death. So we rush, we decorate, we perform. Slowly, our symbols lose their soul. They become trends, templates, aesthetic choices, rather than spiritual expressions. And the woman beneath them? She's still aching, still searching, still wondering why the ink didn't fix the fracture. Because no symbol can substitute for identity. You can't tattoo your way into wholeness. You can't decorate over a wound and call it healing. Jung said that healing requires confronting the unconscious, owning the parts of you that terrify you, the rage, the grief, the need, the desire to be loved without earning it, performing for it, or protecting against it. Until that work is done, every act of self-expression risks becoming self-deception. So ask yourself, who chose the symbol, the self or the shadow, the integrated soul or the aching wound? Was the tattoo a celebration or a cry for help? Was it a full-body yes or a momentary escape? These questions matter because without them, the myth persists, the myth that you're empowered because you're inked, that pain transmuted into art is automatically resolved, that image equals truth. But your body is not a billboard. It's a temple. And your identity is not a collage of aesthetic choices, it's a sacred unfolding. When you move from wholeness, you don't need to prove it. You don't need applause. You don't need others to understand your symbols. Because you are the symbol, not of rebellion, of integration, and that is what real empowerment looks like. Quiet, grounded, unmistakable. She's not who you think she is. The woman with tattoos, with eyes that dare and ink that dances across her skin. She's not just bold or wild or different. She's ancient, not in age, but in archetype. She is a living portal into something the modern world has tried to forget, the dark feminine. And whether she knows it or not, whether she speaks its name or not, that energy is moving through her. Waiting, watching, asking not just to be worn, but to be lived. To understand her fully, you have to go deep, past personal history, past individual trauma, down into the collective unconscious where the archetypal feminine resides, not as a woman or a role, but as a force. And in that depth lives everything the surface world has tried to erase: sacred rage, untamed sensuality, wild grief, and unapologetic knowing. The kind of knowing that threatens empires, the kind that can't be controlled. The tattooed woman often carries this archetype, whether consciously or not because she set out to, but because the culture left her no other choice. She wasn't allowed to be soft and strong. She wasn't allowed to feel rage and be loved. She wasn't allowed to bleed without being called broken. So she found another way to exist. She inked herself into visibility. She took the parts of her that were too dangerous, too unruly, too unfeminine, and turned them into symbols. She didn't just reject the good girl, she buried her, because the good girl never protected her. The good girl was punished, rewarded only when silent, sweet, small. And something inside her, something old, older than memory, rose up and said, "No more." That something was Lilith, Kali, Inanna, the faces of the dark feminine, resurfacing in the modern psyche through women who are done playing nice. And you see it in the tattoos. You see it in the serpent winding down her spine, in the red rose pierced by thorns on her chest, in the goddess with swords, in the moth with fire, in the eye that never closes. These are not trends, these are memories. Archetypal memories, rising from the depths of the unconscious and finding form on skin. But here's where it gets dangerous, because wearing a symbol is not the same as living the truth it represents. And many women, in trying to reclaim their feminine power, have unknowingly stopped at the surface. They wear Lilith's defiance without embodying her sovereignty. They tattoo Kali's destruction without surrendering to her wisdom. They claim the sacred sensuality of Inanna without descending into the underworld to reclaim it from shame. The rage they feel is real. The ache for freedom, real. The thirst to be seen, not for how well they perform, but for who they actually are, real. But when that longing is trapped in image, when it lives only in ink, it becomes performance, not power. It becomes a signal to the world, I am not who you thought I was. But it often stops there. And Jung would say, that's not enough. Symbols, he taught us, are doorways, but they are not destinations. You don't just display the dark feminine, you descend into her. You meet her in the places you don't want anyone else to see. The places where your rage still frightens you, where your sensuality still comes with shame, where your wisdom has been dismissed for so long you've started to doubt it yourself. The danger of the tattooed feminine is that she can easily become another mask, just a more rebellious one, a more exciting one, a more defiant version of the persona, and the world eats it up. It says, look how strong she is, look how powerful. But does the world see her? Not really, because she's still hiding, just differently. Now, instead of hiding her rage, she flaunts it. Instead of hiding her pain, she decorates it. Instead of silencing her desire, she posts it. But it's still mediated, still curated, still caught in the same loop of seeking validation in a world that was never designed to honor the full spectrum of the feminine. And so she remains unseen, powerful in appearance, but starving on the inside. Starving to be held in her rawness, to be safe in her anger, to be loved in her darkness, to be told she doesn't have to perform her power, that she is power, even when she's still shaking. This is the call of the unseen feminine, not to be louder, not to be more provocative, but to be real. To say, I'm not here to entertain you, I'm not here to scare you, I'm not here to fit into your idea of wild or sacred or sexy or spiritual. I'm here to remember myself. And that remembering cannot be worn, it must be lived. It must be embodied in how you speak, how you set boundaries, how you make love, how you grieve, how you forgive. It must be carried in your nervous system, not just your aesthetic. It must move through your breath, your blood, your presence, not just your ink. Because the true feminine is not something you decorate, she is something you reclaim. And she doesn't need symbols to be known, she already knows. But most women have been taught to forget. And the tattoos, those bold, burning images, are often the first whisper of remembrance, the first yes after a lifetime of no's, the first act of rebellion that says, I exist on my own terms. That matters, that's sacred, but it's not the end, it's the beginning. Because the journey doesn't stop at self-expression, it goes deeper. It asks, what would it feel like to take the truth I tattooed on my skin and let it live in my body? My choices? My relationships? What would it mean to not just wear the dark feminine, but to trust her? To listen when she says, stop shrinking. To obey when she says, let it burn. To soften when she says, come home. That's what integration looks like. Not rebellion, but return. Not performance, but presence. Not decoration, but devotion. And that is the real power the world is still afraid of. Not the tattooed woman, but the woman who no longer needs tattoos to prove she is free, because she is, in her skin, and far beneath it. There's a moment, often quiet, that arrives after the adrenaline fades, after the ink dries and the bandage is removed, after the compliments come in and the image is uploaded and the story behind the tattoo is told for the 100th time. It's a subtle ache, a question she may not even speak out loud. Why do I still feel empty? It's not that the tattoo was a mistake, it meant something. In that moment it gave her a sense of control, of expression, of power. But as time passes, she begins to notice the dissonance, the widening gap between the symbol on her skin and the unresolved truth inside her body. Carl Jung warned of this. He said, "What is not made conscious returns as fate," and for many women, tattoos, meant to liberate, slowly become unconscious scripts, not paths to healing but masks that hide the deeper work. They become identity anchors, tethering them to a version of themselves that was never whole to begin with. Because the truth is, identity that is externalized eventually hardens. It stops evolving. And when a woman uses tattoos to define who she is, especially before she knows who she is, she risks locking herself into a persona that keeps her from growing, a curated self, a visual narrative she must now uphold, even when her heart has outgrown it. It begins subtly. She starts to feel misunderstood, not because others don't like her tattoos, but because they don't look beyond them. People assume they know her story, her strength, her edge. They see the symbols and believe they've seen her soul. But they haven't. They've seen a version, a slice, a performative layer built during a time when she needed protection more than connection. And eventually that protection becomes a prison. She finds herself repeating the same phrases about what her tattoos mean, but they don't feel real anymore. The words taste like someone else's story. The symbol that once gave her a voice now feels like a script she's tired of performing. That's the psychological cost, this slow erosion of authenticity beneath the weight of an identity she can't take off. Because the deeper the pain that birthed the symbol, the more seductive it becomes to let the symbol speak for her. It feels safer, more palatable. The dagger on her arm tells you she's strong, so she doesn't have to show you her fear. The lion on her back tells you she's brave, so she doesn't have to admit she's exhausted. The quote across her ribs tells you she's healed, so she never has to say she's still bleeding. But healing can't be outsourced to ink. And when the image becomes more real than the emotion, disconnection sets in. She looks in the mirror and sees power, but feels powerless. She's seen everywhere, and yet she's not known anywhere. Her story is public, but her soul remains private, even to herself. Because tattoos by nature are permanent, but pain is not. Pain moves, grief shifts, rage transforms, identity should evolve. But when you mark a wound before it's healed, you risk freezing it. You immortalize a moment that was never meant to last. And with that comes a new kind of burden. What happens when I'm no longer the person this tattoo represents? Some try to rewrite the meaning, to reframe the symbol, to say, well, it means something different to me now, and sometimes that's true, but often it's not. Often it's a way to maintain the illusion, because admitting that the tattoo no longer fits would mean admitting that she's changed, that she needs new language, new symbols, new space. And that's terrifying in a culture that demands consistency, that punishes women for shifting, for being fluid, for outgrowing their own narratives. And so she stays, in the image, in the ink, in the identity she built as a lifeline, but now wears like a chain. It's heartbreaking, because it was never meant to be this way. The tattoo was supposed to be a symbol of freedom, a declaration of self, a portal into something deeper. But somewhere along the way, it became the thing she had to live up to, and anything that must be maintained becomes a performance, not a presence. This is where Jung's words echo like a warning. What is not made conscious returns as fate. If she doesn't become conscious of the deeper pain behind the ink, if she doesn't confront the shadow that chose the symbol, she will keep living out the same emotional patterns, the same heartbreaks, the same self-abandonment, the same hunger for connection, paired with the same fear of being seen. The tattoo doesn't cause the fate, but it cements it. It solidifies the unspoken story. It says, "This is who I am," before she's had a chance to truly ask, "Who do I want to become?" And when the unconscious writes your story, fate doesn't feel like destiny. It feels like repetition, like a loop you can't escape, like an identity you can't evolve past. That's the cost. Not the tattoo itself, but the way it can trick the psyche into thinking the work is done, into thinking the symbol is the healing when it was only ever meant to be a signpost. The real healing lives in the integration, in the quiet, in the days when she takes off the mask and says, "I'm still figuring it out," in the nights when she lets the tears fall and finally doesn't apologize for being soft, in the moments when she looks past the tattoo and into the wound it marked, and chooses to hold that wound, not hide it. Because only then does the symbol regain its sacredness. Only then does it stop being a performance. Only then does it stop dictating who she must be and start reminding her of what she's overcome. But that takes honesty. It takes a willingness to let the symbol die if necessary, to admit, "This version of me is complete, I am no longer her," and to begin again, not with ink, but with intention, with awareness. That is how you break the loop. That is how you reclaim the tattoo from the fate it became. That is how you transform image back into essence. And perhaps, for the first time in her life, she doesn't just feel seen, she feels known. There comes a point in the journey, if you're honest with yourself, when the image is no longer enough, when the symbol on your skin begins to whisper instead of shout, when it stops asking to be seen and starts asking to be understood. That's the threshold of individuation, the turning point where the mask falls away and something deeper begins to rise. Not a performance, not a persona, but presence, truth, wholeness. Carl Jung didn't promise this path would be easy. In fact, he said quite the opposite. The process of individuation, the path toward becoming your whole self, is not glamorous. It is not linear. It does not reward appearances. It asks for everything that's real. It pulls you inward, beneath the tattoos, beneath the stories, beneath the roles you've played to survive. And if you listen closely, it begins to show you the difference between identity and soul. Because the soul doesn't need symbols, it creates them only when necessary, not to impress, not to declare, not to seduce, but to remember, to call you home when the noise of the world tries to drown out your own knowing. This is what happens when a tattoo is chosen from the soul, not the wound. It doesn't scream for attention. It hums, it breathes. It lives quietly on your body like a prayer you don't need to recite out loud. It doesn't make you anyone. It reflects who you already are. And if you lost the ink, the truth would still be there, pulsing in your blood, steady in your step, woven into how you show up for yourself and others. That's the sacred potential of the tattoo, not just as art, but as ritual. A ritual that marks not escape, but embodiment. A line that says, "This is not where I broke, this is where I return to myself." But that kind of ink only emerges when you've done the work, when you've stopped reaching for symbols to say what you haven't yet dared to feel, when you've stopped trying to convince the world of your power and started living it in how you love, how you grieve, how you forgive. Too many women use tattoos as an armor when what they really need is a mirror, not to reflect an image, but to reflect honesty, the kind of honesty that says, "I was hurting when I chose this. I was lost when I made that part of my identity. I needed something outside of me to hold what I couldn't hold inside." And that honesty is not shameful, it's sacred. It's the first step toward integration, because once you see the symbol for what it truly is, not just what you told the world it was, you can begin to reclaim your story. And that's when the healing begins. When you stop performing your strength and start trusting it. When you stop curating your freedom and start living it. When you stop needing to be seen and finally start seeing yourself. You realize you are not the phoenix on your back, the sword on your thigh, the goddess on your arm. You are what those symbols were pointing toward. You are the transformation, the courage, the divinity, not because it's inked into you, but because it's always been inside you. And suddenly, you don't need to keep proving it anymore. You don't need to explain your tattoos or add more of them to feel complete. You don't need to chase meaning through symbols, because meaning is now in your movement, your gaze, your decisions, your breath. You've turned inward, you've come home. That's what integration is. It's when the parts of you that were once fragmented finally sit at the same table, when the shadow no longer sabotages but strengthens, when the inner masculine no longer dominates but protects, when the feminine no longer hides but radiates, quietly, without needing permission. And the tattoos? They're still there, but they no longer define you. They no longer carry the burden of your identity. They've become what they were always meant to be, reminders, not replacements. They are no longer armor, they are artifacts. And if someone sees them, great. But if they don't, that's okay too, because you no longer live to be seen. You live to be whole. To the tattooed woman reading this, you have nothing to prove. Not to the world, not to the mirror, not even to yourself. You were never meant to carry your story on your skin. You were meant to embody it, to walk it, speak it, breathe it, cry it, heal it. Because the truth doesn't live in the ink. It lives in you. And the deeper you go, the more you realize the tattoos were never the destination. They were signposts, warnings, whispers from your soul saying, "There's more, keep going." So keep going, keep integrating, keep choosing presence over performance. And remember, the woman you're becoming, she doesn't need symbols. She is the symbol. She is what the tattoos were trying to help you remember all along.